Along the way, I finished my bachelor's and master's, actually both in human resources, and so my whole career has been in HR. And in my master's degree work, I actually focused my project on using job descriptions and other sets of job data to create effective hiring processes and also to tie them to employee evaluation systems. So the focus was on how do we develop and put into some format data about jobs so that we might be able to use it for multiple purposes. So if you have not already, if you'll please mute yourself, or Bree will mute everybody so we don't hear your background office noise, that would be super. And again, you do have a tool to raise your hand on the bottom of your screen, and if you do that, Bree is going to keep an eye on it today and help me since we have so many folks on board today. So let's go ahead and get started with job descriptions. And I think, as I've always looked at job descriptions, I think there are 3 reasons that we want to have that data. One, we just flat out want to have accurate data about our jobs. We want to do that just as a part of what we do in HR to be able to describe jobs because we use them for so many reasons. 2, legally there are reasons we have to have it. And as I indicated, the usefulness of it goes well beyond just having what we call a job description itself. So let's get started with the next slide and a pop quiz for you. So, oh my gosh, a pop quiz. Don't freak out because we'll get through the next set of questions and see if you answer yourself yes or no. And then by the end of the session, I'll give you another quiz to see where you're at. So let's get started with question number 1, which is, do you have a formal system in place to ensure that your job descriptions are kept up to date? And you might even answer in that question, do you even have a system in place to do job descriptions at all? Many of us have a binder of job descriptions that somebody left for us. It's back on a shelf or in a file somewhere, but we haven't looked at them for some time. And that's okay. Just so you know, a lot of school districts struggle with maintaining job description data and keeping them up to date. So just make yourself a little tick whether you answered yes or no, and let's take a look at question number 2, which is, our administrators understand the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, all the EEOC rules, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission rules, the Equal Pay Act, the Civil Rights Act, basically the laws that apply to job data and regulations about jobs. Do your administrators understand the requirements for your jobs and things that they have to be aware of when they're supervising employees? So just answer yourself yes or no, and we'll go on to question number 3. Have you thought about the link between job data and compensation strategies? And one of the things that we deal a lot in bargaining and just in general with people being happy or unhappy is what they're paid. And do you have a good way of making quality decisions about who should be paid at what pay level based on job data? And we often call that internal equity relationships. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, but just as a note for you, when we talk about compensation, there are 2 things we want to look at. One is internal equity, and that's where you get the most disgruntlement from employees, where they're looking at, well, I'm a secretary, because I get this a lot, but that secretary over there doesn't seem to have the same responsibilities I do, yet that person's paid more than I am. So that's internal equity. How do the jobs stack up within your organization? And then we will also look at external equity, which is how do our jobs stack up to the market outside. In general, people can be not happy about how they stack up to outside entities, but if it's that way across the district, then everybody is kind of in the same boat. And in general, school districts tend to pay a little bit less than market or industry standards, but they have better benefits. So that's just something we know about school district jobs. It fluctuates over time and depending on the region, but generally it's the benefits and for many people, the 9-month schedule that brings them into the school district environment. So both internal equity and external equity, have you thought about that? And as you look at your compensation strategy, do you have good job data to help you make those decisions? So yes or no, just go ahead and make yourself a little note on that. Let's take a look at another question. When you look at recruiting and selecting, from the time you recruit to the time you screen files and you select folks, you use interviews, you use written interviews, oral interviews, does all of those processes, are they built using good, up-to-date job description data? Or in many districts, and I've certainly seen this across the board, do principals or hiring managers just reach in their drawer or their computer and pick up the last set of questions they use and just use those again? And then if they do, are those valid job questions? Are they related to the job description or not? So do you, in fact, utilize accurate and up-to-date job information in your hiring process is the bottom line. So let's go ahead and answer yes or no to that question. And kind of keeping a tally of where you're at and how far you think you're coming down the spectrum in terms of using your job data. Let's look at one other question. Do you feel confident in your ADA reasonable accommodation processes when needed for persons with disabilities? I know a couple of districts that are on the phone that I've helped work through an ADA accommodation request for individuals with disabilities, and then you have to go back and look at the job description, make sure it's accurate, and provide it to the doctor and go through all of these different things. So do you have enough information, and are your job descriptions detailed enough and up-to-date enough to provide that information for processing a reasonable accommodation request? And then I'm going to give you one more question, so let's take a look at that. Do your employees fully understand each of the standards by which they're going to be evaluated prior to the beginning of their performance appraisals? In other words, do your employees and your supervisors have a good understanding of what the job requirements are, what the job descriptions state, and is there some connection to that in the evaluation tool that you use so that we can effectively assess people on their job requirements? So answer yes or no to that. So I'm not going to record your answers. They're just for you to have, but I will be walking you through in this system how we can take a look at building job descriptions and how we can use that data. And speaking of using that data, let's take a look at the next item. When you really take the time to build accurate job information, and time is the key we'll talk about, it truly becomes the center point of so much of what you do. And I know when I moved from Kent to South Kitsap, one of the first things that I did was take a look at the job descriptions because I'm so used to using them for so many functions. From at the top recruitment to hiring and placement, as people want to change positions. If you have really good job descriptions in place and they're accurate, it helps with those internal transfer processes where people apply and they're not really qualified for the position, but when you have a lack of job description statements, then people can apply and you don't have a leg to stand on to say, no, you're not eligible to transfer for that position or you're not qualified. Certainly use it in collective bargaining, compensation, all of the injury prevention, return to work, accommodations, and with performance appraisal. So to me, the job description sits at the heart of really most of what we do in HR. I don't know there's much we do that's not involving in some way or another the job description. So let's take a look at the kind of a little bit of history and legal areas related to the job description just so we can build that as a foundation today. So next, Bree's moving the slides for me. Thank you, Bree. So from a historical perspective, we can go all the way back to the Equal Pay Act of 1963. So we're talking years ago. And that law specifically stated that you cannot discriminate based on gender, but it went on to say, in order to define discrimination, you should look at comparable worth. That was a big word that came out in the late 60s all the way through to the 80s, comparable worth studies, to determine if jobs in one particular job had a comparable worth to another job. In the law, which still stands today, tells us that we need to look at jobs minimally in 4 categories: skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. So one of the cardinal rules of building a job description has been in place since 1963, and it says if you've got a job description document in some way, and it doesn't have to be in these same words, you have to describe the skill it takes to do a job, and we often call it knowledge, skill, and abilities, or the KSA, knowledge, skill, ability. We have to look at the effort it takes to do a job, what kind of, again, abilities are required to do that job. What is the person's responsibilities? Like with a budget, do they have no financial responsibilities or a lot of financial responsibilities? With equipment, do they have little or no, or do they have a lot of hefty responsibilities? We have to identify those, as well as the working conditions, both physical and environmental. So a lot of people do not realize, if you haven't kind of been in this world, that this law's been there since 1963. And there are a lot of ways that you can format job descriptions, and the law doesn't care how you format them, but it does care that you have these 4 items identified within a job description. So if we were in a room, I'd say, how many of you are aware of that? And usually very few hands are raised, so just so you're familiar with that. Let's take a look next at the Civil Rights Act, which came in 1 year later in 1964, and actually, technically, there were only about 8 months between these. So this is the big one that we've all kind of been familiar with, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which just basically prohibited discrimination in any employment-related practice on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, and sex. And of course, now that list has been expanded. It also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So they were created in 1964, and as an add-on note to that, in 1978, the EEOC created what they call the Equal Employment Opportunity Uniform Guidelines on Hiring, on Recruitment and Selection. The 1978 Uniform Guidelines on Recruitment and Selection. That guidelines, that set of rules, still stands today as the gospel truth, the bottom line. We have to comply with things that are in those guidelines, and I'll be referring to those throughout my presentation today. So all the way back to 1964, we've had that. And then along came, let's take a look at the American with Disabilities Act, which we refer to as ADA, in 1990, modified in 2008, but basically provided for non-discrimination against those who are differently abled, a word I've learned to say from my friends, differently abled. I like that. Anyway, so here we have this set of laws that says we really need to look at jobs. What's really ironic is that not anywhere in any of these laws does it say you must have a written job description. But in the inverse of that, it constantly refers to the fact that you have a description of your jobs. So by inference, we say the laws require us to have a job description. And for all practical purposes, if you get into a legal situation, anything that involves recruitment and selection, you're almost always commanded to provide your current job description for the position. So now that we have a little bit of background on the legal, and we're sitting there going, okay, well, yeah, we don't have them, or maybe we haven't updated them for a while. How do we do this? So let's take a look at the basic design of a job description and things that we need to know about that. First of all, you do need to make sure they're up to date. We recommend that you make yourself a little grid. Again, I'll just refer to South Kitsap. I think we had 62 different job descriptions. And so we just said, well, we're going to review those every 5 years, which roughly gave us about 12 to review each year, which means we had to review one a month. So this is an activity that takes your time for sure. Now, the review shouldn't take that long. A review means sending it out to current job incumbents, supervisors, and HR, seeing if anybody has any feedback for changes and updating it. So that really shouldn't take that long, and it's really important that you have that in your HR calendar. I'm hoping all of you have a HR calendar of things you are required to do in the HR office every month or every year or whatever, and updating job descriptions should be on that. You certainly want to make sure that they're legally compliant, so we want to make sure they're addressing those 4 areas, that they accurately identify things that are required in the job and they don't go beyond that. Let me make a little side note here when I make that note, and I think I have somewhere I talk about it later, but just in case. As an example, frequently in job descriptions, and we've had this discussion in WASPA webinars before and with Chris Burton, gosh, now I'm trying to think of the date of that case. It's just long, long ago, 1970s case, where it was determined that we cannot require things in a job description that truly are not required in the job itself. So as an example, we cannot require most blue-collar workers to hold a high school diploma. And yet today we still see that language in job descriptions, required high school diploma or GED. Now, we can make that statement if we're confident that to do this job, the person has to have a 12th grade education. In other words, maybe 12th grade ability to read, write, and communicate. But what we know from over and over and over again work with positions like custodians is that they don't need to know 12th grade math. And they really don't need to know 12th grade reading. Most of the written material that custodians get is somewhere between 8th and 10th grade reading level, and most of the math they get is also at the same level. In fact, most of the math they get is such a low level that it's normally, in today's mathematical world, more like 5th or 6th grade math. So we have to be very careful with making sure that we have statements in our job descriptions that are also legally compliant. And then there are some best practice approaches for format and structure, and we'll take a look at those later. I'll have some samples for you to look at. And you want to make sure it's understandable. You don't want to write text in a job description that's so high level that a person can't understand it. You want to have a process where your job descriptions, including the compensation or classification, can be reviewed, that people have a way that they can submit a request to have that reviewed. And then you want to not only have the ability to use, but you really want to use your job description in your daily HR decision-making practices. So those are some important elements of thinking about your job description design. But let's take a look at some common problems that we definitely see happening. So information is out of date. We get that a lot. I have been called upon as in a consultant role to work with many districts when they get an unhappy applicant who doesn't get a job, particularly in district seniority bypass. And it's up into a grievance or beyond legal process. And one of the things that we're doing is taking a look at the job description, taking a look at the person's qualifications, comparing that to the qualifications of the person that got the job. And what we often find is that the job description has out-of-date information. So that's one of the reasons why you want to make sure that it's, at least fairly current. So as long as you've updated your job description in a 3 to 5 year period, the courts are pretty good with you. They generally think that that's pretty accurate descriptions. Another problem we have is inappropriate data sources. I don't know about you, but I have never done the job of a custodian or a bus driver. So for me to attempt to do that job description on my own would not be a good thing. And when you get into court situations, which I've been in several times, and helping in my own districts and helping other districts, the court will want to know, well, how did you create this job description? Did you just sit in your little ivory tower and do that? Or did you really involve some job incumbents and supervisors of this occupation so that you have valid data? There's also a lot of confusion among the Fair Labor Standard rules for exempt and non-exempt positions, the American with Disabilities rules to determine essential versus marginal functions, how to write a job description in terms of functions, tasks, and methods, and then how to correctly identify the skills, the knowledge, and abilities. We often call them knowledge, skill, abilities, KSAs, the responsibilities that are needed for the job. And it's my intent today to help you with some of that. We also find a lot of times, well, we don't have a job description. In fact, as we set up the online application systems with you and many other clients, and as we're in that setup process, we often hear, well, we don't have that job description. We go, oh, well, we have some samples we can give you, and we do frequently share those. Any of you, the HRM Plus clients, if you're ever needing a job description, I see those requests go out to the WASPA member request, but you can also send those in to us because we have access to other job descriptions and can share them with you. And then finally, I would just say, if you haven't developed job descriptions, there's an expertise to being able to do that, and it takes time. And it's like anything else. Once you ride the bicycle a few times, you get a little more comfortable with it. But I'll never forget, writing my first job descriptions and how difficult I thought it was. And today I find them pretty easy to do because it's the repetition of it. So let's take a look at getting started with job descriptions and what are the components of them. So when we write a job description, this is my recommendation to you. I think there are 6 areas we need to address. We should have a title. We should have a general purpose statement. And that to me is like if you were going to advertise this position in a blog or in a newspaper or something like that, it would be a short statement that summarizes what the job is. We want to identify the functions and then separate them between essential and marginal because the ADA requires that. We want to identify the competencies, the working conditions, and then the experience, education, and job requirements. So whenever I write a job description, I just know those are the 6 things. I don't care what order they're in, other than I usually put the job title at the top, but I don't care. And if you want to add other things, you can, but I'm looking for these 6 things when I look at a job description. So let's go and talk about, well, we're ready. Now we're going to do a job description. So where do we collect this data from? Well, it takes us into some of the rules for EEOC and a whole other webinar we can do with you about valid data. So those 1978 EEOC rules I was discussing with you, that's where we get the rules that when we identify data about a job, and we're going to use that data for things like performance evaluation or recruitment and hiring or dealing with a return to injury, we need to make sure that the data is valid. Those rules, the 1978 Uniform Selection Guidelines, go on to say that you must use one of 3 very specific validity processes. They're scientific validity processes. People read that and they freak out, and I did too when I first read them. I was like, really? And the first one is called, they're all C's. They're construct validity, criterion validity, and content validity. And just in short order, without doing the whole other webinar, construct and criterion validity mean that you set up tests and you test for it and you compare this test result with, they're very difficult to do. There are companies like Boeing in our area, larger companies that do that, and they run these tests and they validate their job and their interview questions and everything against that. We just don't have the time or the expertise to do that or the money. So what we go to then by default is the 3rd C, which is called content validity. Content validity says we're going to establish that the job information we're creating in this job analysis, job description document is valid because we are obtaining the information from what we'll call subject matter experts, SMEs. That's what the 78 guidelines call them, SMEs. And these are people that have expert knowledge about the job. And this is why the courts always question you. Who were the people you used to collect this job data from and validate it? The court's looking for job incumbents, supervisors, other people who know the job well. You can also look at previous job descriptions and job descriptions from other sources. But the key are the top 2, job incumbents and supervisors. which again you go, well, I might have time to write a job description because I could get one from another district and blah, blah, blah. But if you don't take the time to validate that within your own organization, you run into trouble. So let's take a look at what we call transportability, and I define that on the next slide. So again, this is a term that's in those 78 EEOC guidelines. What transportability discusses is the fact that if you take a job description, let's say a bus driver from some other district, and then you say, oh, this looks good, we're just going to use it here. You cannot do that. You are required by the law to validate that those requirements work in your organization. For example, when I was working on the bus driver job description in South Kitsap, I had the one from Kent. I also had gotten some examples from some districts that I had known and people I knew through ASPA in California. And I was looking through them, I noticed that I really liked the way the job description from California was written, but I noticed an item that was really different. They didn't have anything about preparing the vehicle, the bus, for inclement weather. And I knew that in South Kitsap, the drivers were required to do that. Now, not all bus drivers are required to do that. Sometimes somebody else does. But it's common in our area that bus drivers are required to chain up those rigs and know how to operate them in inclement conditions. And so if I had just moved over the California description and not taken time to validate it with our bus drivers, I would have missed putting that information in there, and therefore my job description would not have been validated. So you don't have to have every little nut and bolt thing in a job description. It's not a task list, it's a major function list. But preparing a vehicle for inclement weather is a pretty big function, and they're just not required to do that in Southern California, and they are required to do that in the mountains of Washington. So hopefully that's a good example for you and why you need to be careful when looking at other sources. So the bottom line at this point is that you can take job descriptions from other places. You can get them from other districts. You can get them from us, wherever you get them. But you're still required to validate that by somehow meeting with or communicating with groups such as job incumbents and supervisors and making sure that that information is correct. Okay, so let's go forward with building up that job description. One of the best ways I like to do it is what I call conduct a focus group. So again, when I went into South Kitsap, I needed to do job descriptions, period. 62% of the, or 62%, I said that number, 62. It was some, I can't even remember now, 60% though of the secretarial group had filed a grievance because of a classification study that had been done. But when I went to look at it, I found that their job descriptions, I couldn't tell the difference between one and another. It was very difficult in order to make an assessment. So we went about the process of creating focus groups, and we met with people. So we took all the job descriptions in the secretarial, the PSE unit, which included parapros as well, and put them into categories, and we said we're going to meet with representatives. So just as an example, South Kitsap had 10 elementary schools. So we did meet with all 10 elementary head secretaries, but we didn't meet with the office assistants from all 10 schools. We just brought in 5 or 6 representatives from those schools. So you can just have a representative group. I definitely don't like more than 10. I like to deal with 5 to 6 people. And you can start working with them and collecting the data from them about their job, what they do, what does it take to do that job. And I'm going to give you some questions in a minute that will help you work through that. But basically, you're going to ask them, what do you do and what does it take to do the job? And you're going to go through the process, whether you have somebody recording it on a computer, or I like to use the big stand-up easels and record it, and just gather that data, period. So if you can meet with a group of people and just ask them simply, what do you do? And have them write it down. And then what does it take to do this job well? And write that down. You're collecting your data. Then it's your job in HR to take that data and put it into a job description format. And then you'll go back with the group and say, did I capture everything you said? And then eventually you'll send that on out to all employees and supervisors to review. So in the focus group, I like to have employees that are job incumbents and 1 or 2 supervisors that supervise that job. Takes about an hour, sometimes depending on the job. I will tell you, secretarial jobs seem to take longer because they like to be very detailed. Bus drivers, I could meet with them in an hour, hour and a half with a group, and I'd have the data I need about a job. So if you don't have current job descriptions and you're really looking at, oh my gosh, we have to do this, just kind of have to organize it, prioritize it, decide which ones you want to do first, and then start with some focus groups and walk through that process. So let's go on, assuming that we've collected the answers to the questions. What do you do? What do you do it to, with, and why do you do it? That's what helps us build our written statement. So here we have all this information in a list from our meeting, or we have another job description from somebody else. The bottom line is we have found out what they do and what they do it with or to or whatever, and why they do it and what it takes to do it. The American with Disabilities Act came along, and in its rules in 1990, it got more specific about how we write job description statements. So when we define the functions of a job, not only do we have to identify if they're marginal or essential, but in the statement, we have to specifically say, what's the action? In other words, what do they do? What's the object? You can cite some examples, and then why. So for example, I conduct webinars. Okay, my action is I conduct training or I train, one of the two. My action word could be I train. What's my object? Client users. What are some examples? Users that use the online application or the applicant management or the pro dev system, or clients that we do consulting work. Why do you do that? To provide them with expertise and knowledge in order that they can replicate the process within their own organization. So as I start thinking about what's on those pieces of paper, if I use these 4 building blocks, it makes it easier to write my function statements. This was a tool that really helped me learn how to write, so I'm hoping that it will help you learn. So let's take a look at some examples of a police officer. I'm just going to do something totally different. Usually if I bring a group into a room, and I do this when I'm doing training, I'll say, let's all pretend to be police officers, and I'll ask them what you do. And they'll say things like, I drive a patrol car, and I handcuff suspects, and I get a fun list of things. Now I've got to take that list that came out of that focus group meeting, and I've got to turn it into a function statement. So on the bottom half of the page, I've given you, using those building blocks, how to write that statement. Instead of driving a patrol car, the function is, and this doesn't have to be, it can be stated 15,000 different ways, but here's one way to state it. Responds, because that's my action word. What's the object? To calls, I could have said to requests, to notifications, whatever it is. Why? For the purpose of evaluating the situation. Because when I really looked at what they did, the first thing they do is they get a call out. Again, you can term it something else. And they have to evaluate exactly what they do. That's really the first thing that they do. Now, when I look at that function in responding to calls, how they do that and the knowledge, skill, ability to do that becomes more of the detail under it. But the major function is I respond to calls. Another thing they do is they do handcuff suspects, but they really apprehend suspects. Why? For the purpose of protecting the public. So the action word is apprehend, the object is suspects, and then why do they do that? Protect the public. Now in each of these cases, like a function, I can take response to calls, and I can say, which would be a detail underneath that, a task within the function, how do they do that? Respond to call. Well, I might pick up a phone call. I might hear my radio. I might hear my radio and respond on horseback. I might drive a car. There's lots of ways I can respond, but the function is I respond. So driving the patrol car is a task that belongs in the function of respond to calls for the purpose of evaluating a situation. When you write a job description, you're not legally called upon to write more than the function statement, but you can go on and list tasks underneath that, as often it helps to explain the function. Like the drive the patrol car, handcuff suspects is a task under apprehending suspects. Not only do they handcuff them, they might taser them, they might wrestle them to the ground, they might shoot them, discharge a firearm. So there's lots of tasks that go under that. So again, hopefully, when you get this job data, you can use those building blocks I gave you to take it and write the words. So let's take a look at another example with a warehouse worker. So I do my little group, and they tell me, well, we lift and carry boxes and all kinds of things, and we write reports, and we count items, and they just give you anything. It's okay. Take whatever they give you. If you need to clarify it, to write it down so you understand it, fine. Just do your focus group and let them just keep talk, and get as much information as you can. Now, when you go back to your desk, you're going to basically translate that from that language into a job description function statement. So let's take a look at how we might do that. So instead of saying that we lift items, we might more generically and in a function statement say we transport materials, because we can transport by lifting or putting it on a carrying item of some type. We can kick it. We could do lots of ways to move. We could say move materials. That would be fine. Don't have to say transport. You could say move materials, relocate materials. Different words are fine. It's just the idea is to identify it. For the why, to move them to shipping or whatever other reason they do that. That's just one way of saying it. Instead of writing reports, we say prepare reports, because they might write it, they could print it, they might input a form in a computer. And why they do it is to document their shipments. And then instead of just saying we count items, we maintain inventory. Why? Oftentimes the why, when you really get to look at compensation, drives the value of a job, because most jobs, for example, prepare reports. Now, you can easily see the difference between somebody who's a receptionist and maintains a list of people who visited in the office or something like that, versus somebody who prepares the S-275 report. Hello, that's a big difference in the value of the job because of the details required to do that. So that's why another reason why when we write a function, we often write samples of the task underneath that, but we don't have to, but we can. It really helps with identifying the value of jobs. Okay, so let's go on from there. Hopefully you have a good example of how you can take that information and write it into job descriptions. Now, the next thing we want to ask people in our focus groups, I'm going to come back to that, in addition to what you do, is what does it take to do what you do well? And you can just ask that question, but I like to break it down more to help guide that discussion in the focus group into 4 areas. And these really mimic those 4 areas that are in the 1963 Civil Rights Act. And these 4 areas really have become known in the job description world as kind of a common platform that people use. Again, these words might be slightly different, but we really want to take a look at what does it take to do your job well in terms of the complexity of the job, your responsibilities, your skill and knowledge, and your working conditions. So let's take a look at these even in more detail. So when I go into a focus group meeting, I have a little cheat sheet, and I will ask them this question. In your job, are you responsible for coordinating things? Do you coordinate people? Well, yes, I do my boss's schedule. Well, I'm the main substitute dispatcher, and we still do that manually. Okay, your coordination with people is a very high-level activity, consumes a lot of your job. Tells me a lot more about the kind of knowledge and skills you have to have versus somebody who does no coordination at all. And when we look at things like complexity, if you want to make a side note, I will also always ask about coordination, diversity, flexibility, and decision-making with people, data, and equipment. So some people, like somebody who works in a print shop, have a lot of coordination of equipment. Generally speaking, that's a lower value because it's pretty rote and the same. then people would have to coordinate people, because people are the most difficult thing to work with. That's just how it is, okay? Then I talk with them about the diversity of their job. Is what you do pretty much the same thing over and over? Payroll is like that, and they darn well better be. We want payroll to be very rote and prescriptive and that they do the same thing every single time, okay? But there are other jobs, like a superintendent, where the diversity is extremely high. They're constantly doing something different with different purposes, different environments, different audiences, and so it really gives you the ability to look at diversity. And sometimes it's hard to differentiate when the differences are so small, and that's not the real idea. You want to define it enough so that you can see the big differences between jobs. But again, I'll ask about the diversity of people, the diversity of data. Some people deal with the same kind of data over and over. I'm the attendance clerk at the junior high or middle school. Guess what I'm dealing with almost all day long? The attendance stuff. When I'm the superintendent secretary in a larger district, the diversity of my data doesn't tend to be too large. But when I'm the superintendent secretary in a small district, I might also be the HR person and the payroll person and the superintendent secretary, and I have a lot of diversity of data. So it tells you about their capacity to have to be a multitasker, basically, and the ability to retain information about diverse sets of data. If I just deal with 1 or 2 or 3 different types of data all day long, that's one set of skills. If I deal with 22 different data sets for 18 different purposes, that's going to increase the complexity of my job. Same thing with flexibility. How flexible do you have to be? And then what are your decision-making skills? Do you follow policies or do you make policies? Makes a difference. So that's just an example of what I call the complexity group. Let's take a look at the responsibility group. So just to help them, instead of saying, oh, what are your responsibility levels, because they tend to get off on a tangent, I specifically asked them the question, do other people oversee your work? And generally, most people say, yes, I have a supervisor. Then I will say, do they oversee you frequently, or do they just check in on you? You know, kind of what is that? In some jobs, there's a lot of oversight. Like in a kitchen area, usually there's a kitchen supervisor who's kind of walking along, checking the quality of the food, you know, everything that's kind of going on. But if you're over in payroll, again, doing your work and you're just kind of going along, usually your supervisor just checks some output report, but it's not checking everything you do every day. So this gives you a differentiation. And then, do you oversee other people? Ask both of those. What are your financial responsibility? Scope of resources required is a minor item, but we're really trying to get at kind of the breadth of the resources they use within your organization. So as the assistant superintendent of personnel, my scope of resources was high because I worked with basically all employee groups, all union groups, the community, the board, and I use a lot of resources. I had to take employee time to meet with to get my information. So it's a smaller item, but a good thing to define. And then finally, what are the consequences of your error, which is usually high for nurses. And we're not indicating here the consequences of error just because they, could possibly remotely make an error. It's the routine of what happens. So obviously in a health room situation, consequences of errors are high anytime you're administering medication or doing things like that. So the next questions I asked them, and after responsibilities, what's your knowledge skill? So what level of math, language, reasoning, education, experience, expertise do you have, and how often do you have to upgrade those skills? That's the kind of stuff that we get stuck with in court cases where we over-define the math and language skills that are required for the job or the education or experience level. I often see job descriptions say 5 years of previous job description required. And I go, really? Why? You show me, because it's hard to make that stick in court. So sometimes it's true, you do need that. If you're going to be a principal building, you would prefer or require that they've had previous experience. But sometimes you can't do that. In an elementary, you're not in an environment where they have assistant principals. So you really have to give that some thought. And then lastly, we will identify the working conditions. So on the next slide, we're going to see those working conditions, the physical demands, the environmental conditions, and what's the risk of impact. So next slide, remember basically that job descriptions identify what is done and why it's done, under what working conditions, and the needed knowledge, skills, and abilities. So if I were sitting with you in a group in a room, which is a little bit easier, we would give it a try. So let's just do that in this webinar environment by taking a look on the next slide at a custodian. So this is the kind of thing that I would typically get out of a focus group. We use cleanings and solvents. We do minor maintenance. We clean sidewalks. We're responsible for doing this. This is an actual example that I recently did doing a focus group for a school district with custodial staff. Now, if we look on to the next slide, I'm just going to take those same things and put them into a function description. And I realize here in the webinar I'm not able to point and click to you back and forth. But on the prior slide, we had the note about them using cleaning solvents and also being responsible for cleaning things. Just merge that into one statement, again using that building block. Cleans what? Assigned facilities and grounds. As an example, classrooms, offices, blah, blah, blah. Why? To maintain a sanitary, safe, and attractive environment. Now, underneath that, I could list the things that they do to clean, but that is the main function. And then I went on and defined the others, so you can see an example of that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So after you define the functions, you're going to decide, is it essential or non-essential? To me, most things in a job description are essential, and they almost always end up being that way. But the bottom line is, would removing that function fundamentally change the job? And it's important to remember this in a long term. I mean, we may short term accommodate somebody by saying, well, this is a required function, but for it's an essential function, but for 3 weeks we could handle somebody else pulling the weight while you did that, but not on a long term. So you're trying to think long term, would removing that function fundamentally change the job? And that's what you have to look at in terms of essential versus non-essential. And then let's take a note at a few other things to think about in updating or creating your job descriptions on the next slide. So as I've kind of just wrapping up this section, how many job descriptions do you have to have updated? Is there a priority to which ones to get done first? Is there a need to value the jobs as well as create the job data, or are you just doing the job descriptions? In other words, do you have to create some kind of a numeric assessment to the jobs so that you can use them for compensation, because that adds a whole bunch of work, and that's another webinar on how to do that, but we can do that. How will we go about collecting the data? I recommend strongly the little focus group. It works well. Do we have staff with the expertise to do this work? If not, like I just helped a small district last year. They had me come in. We identified, I think, about 15 different focus groups that they were going to have. And over a 2-day period, we brought in about, I think, 10 of those groups, 5 per day. So the first day, I ran 4 focus groups. And then the 5th one of the day, I had the staff of that district run. And then the next morning, I ran 1 just to kick it off, and then they ran the other 4 with me in the room. So by the time I left, they knew how to run a focus group. It worked really well. And then they collected the data, and then I wrote one of the job descriptions, and I had them write job descriptions so we could share that, and of course less of my time they had to pay for, and then I just critiqued what they did, and it worked really well. So that's really helpful. So sometimes an outside consultant can help you, but otherwise you're free to do them on your own. So let's just summarize again why we want to do this job description stuff. So taking a look at the next slide, we see that circle again. Once we have that data, we can use it for all of these reasons. So let's talk specifically on the next slide about recruiting and hiring. Because you have our online applications, these job descriptions are attached, and you have the ability to have the applicants look at that data and you can ask them in interview questions, you know, did you read the job description? Can you perform the job description? However you want to do it. But it really allows for a clearer picture of what it takes to do that job well. And once you have that data, you can now drive your interview questions to make sure that they're focused on that job information. A little side note, worked with the district, and I've told this story a number of times, so if it's a repeat for you, I apologize, where the district did a seniority bypass. It was a food service position. It went all the way to arbitration before I was ever called in to help, and the arbitrator ruled against the district big time. And unfortunately, they got an arbitrator who used to work for the Human Rights Commission, who really knew the EEO rules, so it was like the worst of the worst. But one of the things the arbitrator really nailed the district on is that their set of interview questions barely touched the functions of the job. They actually had a current, up-to-date, well-written, function-based job description. And I think there were 8 essential functions of the job. But when you took a look at the interview questions, they only addressed like 2 or 3 of the functions. Therefore, the arbitrator ruled that this very experienced in-district applicant did not have an opportunity to present their knowledge, skills, and abilities to do that job and all these other functions because they weren't even asked those questions. So it is really important to connect the dots between especially the essential functions of a job and your interview questions to make sure your interview questions are covering all of those essential job functions. You should have at least, you know, a question that covers those functions. One interview question might cover 2 or 3 questions, but you've got to make sure that they cover all those essential functions. So do make sure you do that. Let's take a look at the next slide. And we'll talk about how we use information for employee performance. And this is kind of extending it out. But to me, if we've done a job description and we've decided this is what it takes to be an effective teacher, then why wouldn't we use that to evaluate them on? So the inverse of that, right now there's been a lot of work done with all the models of teacher performance that you're going through to say, this is what we're going to evaluate teachers on because we think this is what it takes to do the job well. Okay, take that information and take it back through your job description and make sure your job description reflects that same information and use those words so that you can really truly say, as you look at your employee performance or evaluation tool, that it's also covering all the essential functions of the job. So both the interview questions, written tests, employee evaluations, those kind of tools should connect the dots to the job description, both coming and going. Okay, let's take a look then at reclassification requests. So now if you do have a process in place or you have a request from the union or however to look at reclassifications, now you have enough job information that you can use data. Use the data or data, however you want to say that, to drive your decision. So many times reclassification request or the decision to make a new job title and separate this one out and pay it more, or however you do that, is emotional. Bad decision. You really want to walk through a process where you can value your jobs, assign points to them, and then use those points to assess the job. So let's take a look at the next slide. And I'll just make a note, that's a whole nother webinar, and if you have an interest in doing that, you can let us know. We'd be glad to put that up for you in terms of compensation assessment. But there's a way to go into those jobs, look at those knowledge, skills, and abilities, and come out with some points. So let's just say that we did that, and we have job A, B, and C as shown here, and currently their salary levels are 3, 4, and 5. But when we took a look at the point values, we saw that job B, which is paid lower than job C, actually, according to our work, is more valued. It's a higher value. So this data result would say to us, hey, we need to take a look at job B in comparison to job A and C. Looking at our internal equity is what we're doing. We may look at all of these jobs externally, but internally we can look at the points to see what that value is. So let's take a look at the next slide as well to take another look at a data set. This is where we can take those points. For example, let's say we did a group of jobs, custodial, and then we did maintenance trade jobs. This is actually live data from South Kitsap when I did this. So we had a maintenance trade laborer position, which by the points was the lowest point possible, as you can see in the middle of that screen where it's just above the 6 line. And then it's about 200 points, or it's about 130 points or so. And then over to the left, we had another job, which was like assistant custodial. I can't remember what we called that. It was like a labor custodial. We actually determined it was of a higher value than the laborer in maintenance. And then we have a third dot, and then we start getting dots that kind of come close together. And you can see the 3 dots of custodial are very close to the 2 dots in trades. That tells me that those job groups, those 5 jobs, should be very similar in compensation. And then it also showed me that I have 2 more groups in trades that probably should be above that, 2 that are together and then a group of 4 that are pretty close together. So when you do these numeric assessments, you have data that can drive the decisions, which helps immensely when you're at the bargaining table and having to go through these. So I put these into this webinar on job descriptions because it's important to know that you can use that data, and if you ever need assistance with compensation and assessment, again, we can do another training for you. So let's move on. If you do your compensation, you want to do a market analysis for your external equity, just little notes about various places that you can survey. And on the next slide, a little bit of note about your sources. Make sure that you identify who is your competitive market. I was helping the ESD 113 in Olympia do some work like this. Right across the street at the time, they have a huge hospital. Hey, they were competing with those people for sure for jobs. So we needed to find out from that hospital what their compensation was for specific jobs because they were losing people to the hospital. So you really do want to identify who is your competitive market. When I was in South Kitsap, we had some difficulty recruiting LPNs, and we knew our competitive market was all the medical facilities, which were large in that area because of the military bases. So we had to collect data from those sources to see what our competition was and why we were losing so many people and had so much turnover. And then you can do, I just got a couple more slides to show you quickly. I'm not going to dwell on these. So on our next slide, we're going to see how you can graph that external data so you can see how are we in comparison to all of our external market folks. And you can graph it this way where you compare them. You can also on the next page kind of graph it from job to job to show you kind of where you're at. So just some quick samples of how you can add value to jobs and then use that data to go on and do compensation activity. Okay, let's go on to the next slide just real quickly. Injury prevention, early return to work. Oh my gosh, can you save money? Okay, so here's a real life situation from South Kitsap. Our workers' comp cost claims were over $800,000 a year. And I didn't know I was going to be responsible for that, but I was. So I thought, that seems high. And I compared it and said, yeah, I think it's high. So I looked at what was causing it. Food service, custodian, and our bus mechanics were the big 3. And what I found out is that when people were injured, they would go to the doctors and say, oh yeah, I'm required to do this and I have to lift 80 pounds and all this stuff, and it wasn't even true. And so the doctor would write a note, they're out. So we just very quickly inserted a new practice. When you're injured, you have to, within 24 hours, contact HR. We will ask you who your physician is, and we will fax, email, or however we need to get it there, the current job description to the physician. And then we had a statement that went with it where we asked the physician to sign off whether they could do each of the functions or not, and that included the physical requirements for the job and the environmental conditions, and I'll show you some examples of those written job descriptions. amazing how many times the doctors all of a sudden are saying, yeah, they can return to work. Or they can return to work, but for 2 weeks, please limit their lifting to this, whatever. They weren't required to lift any 80 pounds. That just simply wasn't true. The other thing that I did is I actually asked a local physical therapist that I knew from my work with the Chamber of Commerce if we could hire him to go with us out and take a look at a couple jobs. So we went down to Sedgwick Junior High, and we were looking at custodians. And they were pushing these mop buckets around that had water in them, and the water was, as a bucket would be, filled to the top. Well, they had to push these, and water is heavy. So this physical therapist says, do they really have to have the bucket so full of water? I said, I don't know. Let's ask them. So we said, what would happen if you only had half that bucket full of water? They said, yeah, it would work. We had them try it, and it worked. We had maintenance go down and paint the inside of every bucket with the fill line. They did a red mark on the buckets and only put half that amount of water in there, which reduced the amount of push and pull of weight they had to do in their job description. And the employees were thrilled that we were there and we cared enough to do something like that. There were other examples. In food service, we found a lot of problems where they were lifting these heavy boxes of like frozen French fries out of the freezer. First of all, we found that they were putting heavier boxes on the bottom shelf, so we said, no, let's store them differently. And then we just bought this like $1,000 hydraulic lift where they could move the cart over, push it down, slide the box to the lift, and then push the button, and it would lift it back up for them. Oh my gosh, what a savings. And again, the employee just saying, wow, thanks for thinking about us. It didn't take but a couple hours to do each of those, so it was pretty minimal effort. And then what happened? Do you know that the next year our compensation claims went down to $200,000? And they never went over that for all the years that I remained in South Kitsap. And after 3 years of that, our actual rate went down, and we started saving big-time money on our workers' compensation costs. I can't remember today how much it was, but it was a huge amount of money that we saved just by taking the time to do the job description and questioning what those physical requirements were. So when a custodian or somebody tells you, I have to lift 80 pounds, you need to take the time to find out why and how are you doing that and for what purpose and how often, and really take the extra hour to examine that and see if there isn't another way to make that work with tools or something changing so that they're not subjected to that kind of physical requirement. So it was an awesome success story. So on the next slide then, that certainly gave us a lot more information to deal with when we did have to do an accommodation, and we could be realistically speaking with physicians and attorneys and workers' comp people about what was truly required in that job, and it just made it a lot easier. Now we are going to take a look at some sample job descriptions, but let's go through another pop quiz. So let's get started. Oh no, not another quiz. So question number 1. Would you say that you now feel more confident about doing job descriptions and the process and what it takes to do that? Hopefully some of you are answering yes. I realize it takes some time to climb that ladder, but hopefully you're feeling a little better. Let's take a at the next question. Do you feel better prepared to explain the processes that have to be utilized, doing the focus group, taking that data and putting it into a format, identifying the functions, the working conditions, asking them, you know, what they do and why they do it, going through those complexity questions, those kind of things. Hopefully you feel a little bit better prepared and you can use the information in the slides to help you. Let's go to the next question. Do you understand that once that you've taken the time to do this job data and collect it and validate it, that it can be used in lots of functions, and how important it is, in fact, to do that, to make sure that your interview questions reflect the functions, to make sure your evaluations reflect the functions, and vice versa. So sometimes you can look at an evaluation tool and say, oh, we're missing a function from the job. We didn't even write that, so you can do it. So it's really good to use those hand in hand. And another question for you. That was the last question. So back to this circle again. Back to the job description circle of life. this data, once developed, can be used for so many purposes. So don't just get stuck on the idea that you're using it for the purpose of posting up a job description. That is important, that people know what it takes to do a job and do it well. But it's more important that you understand how many other ways it can be used and that you incorporate that. You train your administrators. You can use these slides if you want to. You're welcome to use anything in here. I don't have any patent on it or whatever. Feel free to take the PowerPoint we sent you and do what you want with it. Let's now take a look at some job descriptions. And I think if Bree hasn't, she's going to email these to you. And many of these came from some samples from our clients. So let's take a look at the first one. So this is an assistant principal high school. So just in the format, we have a summary statement. We have a context and mission statement. Talk a little bit about your organization, so that's fine. That summary statement is exactly what you're looking for. You could have things at the top like group or reports to or work days. You don't have to have those, but you can. It is important at the top, you'll see the FLSA status is exempt. It's good to put that on the job description so you have a record of it somewhere. One way or another, you need to record it, so why not put that in the job description? But you'll see toward the bottom that it begins with an essential duties and responsibilities list. So let's just scroll down and take a look at a few of those that's written in this job description. So Bree, if you can scroll that slide down so we can see the first essential duty and responsibility.
Is it showing up yet? I tried scrolling it down.
Not quite. I don't know if I can scroll it down. Or I'm scrolling it down. I guess it's coming down. Okay. So you will see the first one says assist, so that's an action word. Who do they assist? The principal. Kind of an example, in the general administration of the school and serve as the acting principal. What's missing with these that the EEO would like to see, but it's like, why do they do it? So we might say they assist the principal for the purpose of general administration of the school. In reality, it's there. It's just not said for the purpose of. So I'm comfortable. All of these are good statements. I don't have any problem with them. So obviously, as an assistant principal, they do a lot of assisting, and it's okay to repeat an action word. They assist administrators. They assist counselors. They act as a liaison. They supervise systems. Well written. So kudos to this district for doing that. Let's take a look at the next page of this job description. Going on with the functions then, the one thing that I didn't see in this job description is a breakout of which of these functions are essential and which are marginal. And that should be identified. But other than that, the list of functions was fine. Usually the one at the bottom, performs other related duties, blah, blah, blah. That's usually a non-essential function. So whether you call it marginal or non-essential, those two should be identified in the job description. It goes on to identify the minimum qualifications, the preferred qualifications, the conditions of employment. And if we scroll down here, we can see the knowledge of the ability. So those knowledge and ability statements are in here. And then, Bree, if we can go to the next page, we will see a reporting relationship, evaluation, and we do see both physical demands and work environment, which is superb. I would rate this evaluation very well done. I would say, why don't you just go ahead and break out your functions to essential and non-essential, and otherwise I would be fine with it. They also have, which I think is important, the history of the classification on the bottom. And they also have a little statement about job descriptions are how they are representative list of blah, blah, blah. So those kind of statements are nice to have, and you have a record of when you have last done a job description. Let's take a look at another one. So next job description, please, Vanna. Here's a high school math teacher. So we've got a purpose or a summary statement. That's great. It reports to the principal. Oh, essential functions, and they're all identified right there, right on the page. So isn't that nice that we've got the essential? There are no non-essential functions, and you don't have to have them. It's perfectly fine if everything is essential. And then it goes on at the bottom to start identifying the job requirements, experience, education, certificate, FLSA status, has kind of a little legal status at the bottom. And I'm not sure if this goes on in the next page to identify the physical and environmental conditions or not. Can you click that for me? It did not. Now, when you're posting a job description, you may or may not have the physical and environmental conditions in it. I do recommend that they're put in. Here's one I picked up that was just an assistant baseball coach position, but it's got the position title, the skills and qualifications. It says major tasks and responsibilities. And although they're not stated as essential functions, which would be important instead of major tasks and responsibilities, I would probably change that word to essential functions. It does say, you know, I assist the head coach, I do these. And they're kind of mixed up a little bit between things that you're required to have, skills and qualifications, and essential functions. So I probably would organize these a little bit differently, but it's a decent job description is what I would say. It falls in the kind of the medium category for me. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. I think in the bottom of this one it doesn't, yeah. If we go back up to that coach one, I don't think it identified the physical requirements. Let's scroll down. Yeah, there's no physical or working. I definitely would have those included in it. So now let's go to the next one. So this is a lead ground position, reports to a maintenance manager, work schedule, salary information's fine, position summary, essential functions. And in this one, what I liked is it identified the functions that were specifically because they were a lead grounds versus a regular grounds person. And if we scroll down this page, which I think I can do the scrolling, Bree, yeah, then we have desired skills, minimum qualifications. And let's go to the next page, Bree. I can't remember if this has a physical, it does have a work environment on it, including the work environment basically lists some of the physical requirements as well combined together. And it even mentions something about evaluation, has the classification history on it. So you can start to see now kind of things that are, oh yeah, we'd want to have these in our job description. They're all good. It's a level of good. At least they have one. That's the first thing. And I'm hoping that they're pretty current. Now this one was developed in 2006. So I would be looking for something that says, aha, this one definitely needs to be revised because it's been a while. So it should be reviewed and updated for sure. And that's what helps by keeping those dates on those. Okay, let's look at the next one. And this one is for a skilled building and grounds technician. So we see a little, this is the format that we actually created for that district I just recently helped. So a little format at the top on reports to and classification, a job summary, the essential duties and responsibilities, and you can see here how we identified a function statement, prepares for daily assignments, and then put the task under that. That's a format that I find that people, the employees, like a lot. Rather than just listing the function statement, you put sort of the task underneath that. And you'll see that continue on down the page. You have these samples, or you'll be getting them shortly. Let's go to the next page, Bree. And it will continue with more of the same of those functions and task statements. And one more page, please. And then we go on to about midway down the page. You'll see the supervisory responsibilities were none on this particular job. And then we start in with the requirements. So we're going to first identify the education, experience, or certification. And let's go to the next page. So this one, must have cut off. Let's go one more page too. This one is a format that I use. So if you like it, feel free to use it. What's the mathematical skill, reasoning, other skills, and then at the bottom you'll see physical demands and environmental conditions. But let's go on and look at, toward the bottom of the page here, in the physical demands we have a general statement, and in the working environment we have a general statement. But on the next page, if we can get that up, Bree, you're going to see a little cheat sheet I've used, and the reason I wanted you to have this today is that you can use this in that focus group. It really helps. You can hand it out to them. And you can say, in strength and endurance, do you lift? And you would have them describe what they lift. And then you would ask them, how frequently do you do this? And you've got a little grid at the top there in green that tells you, and you've got a code for it. This is the document that we get to the doctor when people are injured, and this is the one that saved us boatloads of money. So you can see that for each of these items, we've identified the item, and then we have the employee tell us what they do to do that, and then we code it based on how frequently they have to do it. And we do that with lifting and body movement and upper extremity. And Bree, if you can go to the next page. Let's try to quickly do this so we can wrap this up for you. You'll see coordination, talking, hearing. Next page. So we walk through all of physical, all the way down to hazards, atmospheric conditions. Just hand it out in your focus group meeting. Have people put down what they do. So your middle column and your end column would be blank. And then they fill it out, and then you can proof it and change it according to what the whole group says. Next page. It's just, and at the bottom there's a little date where you could put notes, and then who reviewed it, and you would also put your information about the date that it was created and the date it was revised. And I think those are the end of the examples, but I'm not sure, Bree, is that the last page of those?
Yeah,
okay.
That's it.
So in this little bit more than an hour, hopefully you have learned about job descriptions, why they're important to do, what the law requires us to do, but how, most importantly to me, to use this set of tools to approach that task in a more reasonable way. Start with a small group. I would never recommend that you start with secretaries first. I don't apologize. They just are very detailed. Start with bus drivers or custodians or a food service group. Even start with teachers. A little bit easier to do. Ask them those questions and give them this list of physical and environmental requirements. Just walk through them with that. I would probably schedule an hour and a half for your meeting. By the time you get in and introduce it and do your work, that's about what it takes. You will have your job data. Then it's going to take you anywhere from an hour to 3 hours, depending on how comfortable and more experienced you get with it, to craft up a draft job description. In doing that, you can compare it to others that you've collected from other sources as well, old ones that you have, any other source of information. Send it back out and get a final review of the group, and then make sure you send it to all job incumbents and allow them to have input, and voila, you're done, and you can go on to the next group. And once you get the original one done, updating them is much easier because you can do that in a quick, maybe 15, 20-minute focus group meeting, and or you can just send them out to people and ask for feedback for the updates. For folks that deal with unions, be sure that you keep the union involved when you're doing these processes so you don't have issues with them at the end. And with that, Bree, I'll turn it over to you and see if we have questions that have come up, or if you want to open it up for questions so we can answer any and let people get back to their desk.
Well, let's open it up for questions. I will unmute people. We may get a little feedback, but feel free if you have a question to ask it. I'm almost got you all unmuted.
So if you can identify your name and district and then ask your question, that would be great.
Are there any questions?
Okay, so we're going to hear any background noise you have in your office, so we're not sure if you're just talking with each other or you have a question for us. And certainly if you're done, you can go ahead and log off the webinar, and you have our contact information to contact us anytime with follow-up. But does anybody there now have a question that we might be able to answer to help somebody else too?
You can also type it if you don't have a microphone and you're logged on through your computer, because I can read your question.
Okay, other than hearing you talking in the background, we're not hearing any questions. So, again, feel free to email us at support@hrmplus.com. We'd be glad to answer questions for you. We're just glad to have you aboard today and hope that you found... Go ahead.
Bree,
you have a question?
This is Beth with the Yakima School District. I do have a quick question. Hi,
okay.
Sherry. Hi, Bree. So, Sherry, you had mentioned that you can't require the high school diploma or GED, you know, as an overall legal issue. So we do require that. So is that something we should go back and take a look at? Because we require all of our custodial food service to have a high school diploma or GED and take and pass the basic skills test.
Yeah, I could see having them pass a basic skills test as long as that skills test is legitimate for the job. But to flat out require them to do those, no, that ruling came down a long time ago. And in fact, there was a huge discussion a couple of years ago about it at WASPA, and Chris Burton did a webinar and said, no, don't do that anymore. Unless you can really show that it takes a high school education to do that job. And I've never, ever personally seen that happen. I've never seen that you have to have that level of education to do that job.
And you know, it's just recently, about a year ago, that we started having them do the basic skills test. And it was just a matter of being able to, you know, read the chemical bottles and, you know, what's in what's in it. But yeah, so do you think taking a look at requiring the high school diploma GED for everybody is something we need to revisit?
Yes, and have Jill call me if she has any questions about it, because I definitely would highly recommend that. I'm not an attorney, but I think an attorney would also, and I know Chris Burton has recommended it, so.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know.
You're welcome. That's the, it's Garcia versus San Antonio. It was a big case on that, and I mean, no, that's not the case either. I can get you the case law if you need it. I have it in another presentation, so.
But yeah, that'd be great, just something to look at, so.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
I will send you that, Beth, just so you have what that rule is. Okay, you bet.
Thanks.
I just want to add that I did record today's webinar because there was a lot of stuff that was covered. And so if you want to listen to it and watch it again, I can get that link to you because there was a lot of information today to absorb. So let me know that as well, because I will.
Bree, why don't we just send the link out with the email afterwards?
Oh, you're so smart.
That would be great, and then our clients will have it.
Okay, perfect.
Any other questions from the gang? Well, it was just super to be with you today. It was my pleasure to share some of the information that's stuffed in my head, and I hope you find it useful as you work through your various HR practices. Have fun with job descriptions. Signing off. This is Sherry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bree, I'm going to send you that legal link for that case on the high school requirements. You can just include it in the email out to them.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.